This is Krista Pike.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death.
Just moments after being sentenced to death in 1996. Nearly 3 decades later, she still sits behind bars, trapped in the waiting game of death row. The sentence was swift, but the execution is still nowhere in sight. However, she is not alone. Across the United States, in the cold, scary cells of death row, dozens of women await their final moment. Some have been there for years, others for decades. But despite their brutal crimes and final punishments, their executions remain uncertain, delayed by appeals, legal battles, and the slow stance of justice. These are the women America has condemned to die. Murderers, arsonists, child killers, each with a story caught up in violence and cold-blooded acts. This is the strange reality of every woman awaiting execution in U.S. prison. Patricia Blackman. On May 29, 1999, a desperate call rang through Dothan, Alabama's emergency dispatch. Patricia Blackman's voice trembled as she reported that her 28-month-old adopted daughter, Dominique Bryant, wasn't breathing. But when paramedics arrived, they discovered something far worse than a tragic accident. They stepped into a crime scene. Little Dominique's body told the truth her mother tried to hide. Her tiny skull was fractured. Her fragile bones were broken in many places. Deep bruises covered her skin, and on her chest, a dark imprint was revealed, a shoe mark pressed into her flesh. She had been beaten, brutalized, and left to die. Investigators peeled back the layers of deception. Patricia Blackman wasn't a grieving mother, she was a killer. The woman entrusted to protect an innocent child had instead become her worst nightmare. But why? What drove her to such unthinkable cruelty? No one could say for certain, but the evidence spoke loud enough. Fast forward to March 2002. A jury found Patricia Blackman guilty of capital murder. The vote was decisive, -10-2 in favor of death. The court upheld the recommendation, sending her to death row. Now, after more than 23 years behind bars, Patricia Blackman remains locked away in Alabama's death row. Her case still available in appeal. Her execution date still unscheduled, but no amount of time can erase the horror of what she did, and no appeal will ever bring back the little girl whose cries went unheard. Manling Williams. On the night of August 7, 2007, in Rowland Heights, California, a young mother took an incomprehensible decision. Manling Williams crept into her son's bedroom as her hands trembled with purpose. 6-year-old Devin and 3-year-old Ian lay peacefully in their beds, unaware that their own mother had become a monster in the darkness. One by one, she pressed a pillow over their tiny faces, silencing their cries, ignoring their desperate struggle. But her night of horror wasn't over. She waited, cleaned herself up, then sat in the stillness of her now lifeless home, waiting for her husband, Neil Williams, to return. When he walked through the door, he never had a chance. In a frenzy of violence, Manling unleashed her fury with a samurai sword, slashing and stabbing him nearly 100 times. His blood painted the walls with his final moments. A brutal, merciless slaughter. Investigators would later piece together the twisted motive. Manling had wanted a fresh start, a new life with another man. But instead of divorce, she chose the death. Her family wasn't an obstacle to overcome. They were pawns to be eliminated. However, justice arrived 3 years later. On October 4, 2010, Manling Williams was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. Now, at 44, she has spent more than 16 years behind bars, her days consumed by silence as her case remains entangled in endless appeals. No execution date has been set, but the weight of her crimes will haunt her forever. Skyler Dion. On November 15, 2004, the open waters off Newport Beach, California, became the setting for an unspeakable betrayal. Thomas and Jackie Hawks had spent their lives saving for a dream, a life of adventure on the sea. But after years aboard their beloved 55-foot yacht, they were ready for a new chapter, hoping to sell their boat and move closer to family. They had no idea their dream would end in horror. Their buyer, Skyler Dion, was not who they thought. With 2 accomplices in tow, Skyler stepped onto the yacht, pretending to be an eager buyer. Under the guise of a test sail, they set out into the ocean. But once the shore disappeared, so did any hope of survival. The attack was swift and merciless. Thomas and Jackie were overpowered, their bodies bound and helpless. With no way to fight back, they were forced to sign over ownership of their yacht, their entire future stolen from them with the stroke of a pen. But paper wasn't enough. The killers had no intention of letting them live. With their hands and feet tied to a heavy anchor, the couple could do nothing but beg for their lives. But their cries were met with cold indifference as they were thrown into the ocean. The weight dragged them deep into the abyss as the dark ocean swallowed them whole. Their bodies were never recovered. It was a perfect crime, at least almost. The truth unraveled when one of Skyler's accomplices broke. confessing the horrifying details. The planning, the deception, the cold-blooded execution, the brutality of the crime left no room for mercy. On April 10, 2009, Skyler Dion was sentenced to death. While incarcerated, she legally transitioned to a woman. Now in her 40s, she has spent more than 15 years on death row, locked away as her case drags through appeals. No execution date has been set, but the sea still holds its secrets, and the weight of her crimes will never sink into oblivion. Kathy Sarinana. The lights of Riverside, California, filled with holiday cheer in December 2005. But inside one house, Christmas was nothing more than a cruel illusion. Behind closed doors, 13-year-old Conrad Morales and his 11-year-old brother Ricky were trapped in a nightmare, living with their aunt, Kathy Sarinana, and her husband, Raul. They were supposed to be safe. Instead, they were prisoners in a house of torment. The walls of that home bore witness to unspeakable horrors. The boys were beaten relentlessly, starved for days, and locked away in suffocating darkness. Every cry for help was swallowed by the silence of fear. But the torment didn't end with bruises and hunger. It escalated into something far worse. On Christmas Eve, while the world celebrated joy and family, Conrad was fighting for his life. The abuse reached its peak as his small body battered beyond repair, his last moments filled with agony. When life faded from his eyes, his killers did not grieve. They stuffed his broken body into a closet and carried on with their holiday celebrations as if nothing had happened. Less than a week later, Ricky suffered the same fate. His screams went unheard and his suffering ignored. When his frail body finally gave in, Kathy and Raul wrapped him in plastic like discarded trash, hiding him in the cold emptiness of the garage. But no amount of deception could mask the truth. The couple tried to cover their tracks, feeding the police a lie that Conrad had slipped in the shower and died. But the truth clawed its way to the surface. The boys had been subjected to months of unimaginable abuse, beaten with belts, scalded with boiling water, and locked away in closets without food, warmth, or hope. Their home had become a torture chamber. In 2009, Kathy Sarinana was convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and child abuse. She was sentenced to death, her fate sealed in the same darkness she had once imposed on her nephews. Now, in her mid-50s, she stays on death row, the years slipping away as her case drags through endless appeals. Christy Michelle Scott. On the night of August 16, 2008, in the quiet town of Russellville, Alabama, a fire erupted inside a family home. Flames devoured everything in their path, thick smoke curling into the night sky. Inside, 6-year-old Mason Scott was trapped, helpless, terrified, and alone. His tiny body never made it out. To the outside world, it seemed like a tragic accident, a mother's worst nightmare. But behind the smoldering ruins lay something far more dark. Christy Michelle Scott was hiding something. Investigators unearthed a shocking truth. The fire wasn't an accident, it was arson. Just before the flames took her son's life, Scott had increased Mason's life insurance policies to over $100,000. She had been searching the internet for fire-related deaths and had purchased gasoline shortly before the blaze. This was premeditated. This was murder. August the 20th, 2009. The verdict came down. Guilty of capital murder. The jury, torn, recommended life without parole in a close 7-5 vote. But the judge saw through the fake tears of a grieving mother turned victim. He overruled the recommendation and sentenced Christy Michelle Scott to death. Now, in 2025, she has spent more than 15 years on Alabama's death row. Belinda Magana. In May 2009, in Riverside, California, 2-year-old Malachi Magana should have been playing, laughing, and feeling the warmth of his mother's love. Instead, he was trapped in a house of horrors, his tiny body racked with pain. His cries met not with comfort, but with cruelty. It began with scalding water. Malachi suffered severe burns, his fragile skin peeling away, his body screaming for relief. But his mother, Belinda Magana, and her boyfriend, Narez Narini, did not rush him to the hospital. They did not try to ease his suffering. They let him crumble in agony for 5 long days, his body blistered and broken, punishing him every time he cried. After a while, the little boy's body could take no more. The pain, the hunger, and the suffering all came to a tragic end. But for Belinda and Nares, there was no remorse, no grief. His death was nothing more than an inconvenience. Instead of calling 911, instead of burying him with dignity, they went to a party in Apple Valley. They drank, they laughed, they celebrated, while Malachi's lifeless body lay abandoned. When they returned the next day, they treated him like garbage, dumping his remains near a creek as if he had never existed. To cover their tracks, they filed a missing child report, spinning lies to shield themselves from justice. But the truth was stronger than their deception. Investigators quickly unraveled the horror of what had happened to Malachi. The evidence spoke for him when he no longer could. Both Belinda and Nares were convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and child abuse. In 2015, Belinda Magana was sentenced to death. Now, in her early 40s, she remains on death row, and the weight of her crime remains inescapable. Sheree Rhodes, February 20th, 2014, was supposed to be a day of reckoning, a moment of justice at the Cedarville Rancheria headquarters in Alturas, California. Tribal leaders had gathered for a crucial meeting, one that would determine the fate of Sheree Rhodes and her family. Accused of embezzling federal grant money, she was on the verge of losing everything. But instead of facing the consequences, she chose violence. The room was tensed when Sheree reached into her bag and pulled out a semi-automatic handgun. A moment of stunned silence was all she needed before she opened fire. The first shots tore through the small meeting room, striking the tribal chairman and 3 others. One by one, she gunned them down, showing no hesitation, no mercy. Blood pooled on the floor. The bodies of her victims slumped where they had once sat in judgment, but she wasn't finished. 2 others lay wounded, gasping for help. As her gun clicked empty, Sheree didn't stop. She grabbed a butcher knife, her hands slick with the blood of those she had already killed. She lunged, intent on finishing what she started. Before she could land another fatal blow, she was overpowered. The carnage was over, but the damage was irreparable. 4 lives taken and a whole tribe destroyed. On September 18, 2017, Sheree Rhodes was convicted of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Witnesses testified that she had shown no remorse, no grief for the lives she had ended. The jury had no doubt. They recommended death. The judge upheld their decision. Now in her 60s, Sheree sits on death row, locked away for over 7 years. Tanya Nelson. 2 decades back, Tanya Nelson started a dangerous plan to end someone. Her target, Huang Hos Smith, a well-known psychic and fortune teller. Once upon a time, Tanya had sought her guidance, desperate for a prophecy that would lead to success. But when her business failed, she didn't blame herself. She blamed the woman who read her fate. With an accomplice by her side, Tanya forced her way into the psychic's home. There was no warning, no hesitation, just rage and cold steel. She and her partner stabbed Huang and her daughter, Anita Vo, over and over again, leaving their bodies in agony. But killing them wasn't enough. She smeared white paint across their corpses, the walls, the floor, erasing, covering, hiding, an attempt to cleanse the scene of her crime. But no amount of paint could mask the horror she left behind. The truth was revealed through phone records, witnesses, and a financial trail that all led back to her. On June 30th, 2010, a jury sealed her fate, sentencing her to death. Now, in her 60s, Tanya Nelson waits, locked away, her own future uncertain. The psychic she murdered never saw it coming. But Tanya, she knows exactly what's waiting for her. She just doesn't know when. Lorraine Hunter. In a very cold afternoon in Moreno Valley, California, back in 2009, Lorraine Hunter lured her husband, Albert Thomas, to his parked truck with a simple request: retrieve her sweatshirt. The cold in the night air masked the cold intent in her heart. As Albert knelt inside the cramped sleeper compartment, rummaging through their belongings, Lorraine's fingers tightened around the grip of a stolen handgun. The weapon, taken from a trusting member of her church, felt heavy in her hand, but her resolve was heavier. Without hesitation, she raised the barrel to the back of his head and pulled the trigger twice. As his body slumped forward, she fired 2 more rounds into his back, ensuring there was no breath left in him. While it was a crime born of greed, investigators later uncovered the reality that Lorraine had forged her husband's signature on over $1 million in life insurance policies, naming herself the sole beneficiary. But the most unsettling detail is the fact that this wasn't her first attempt. She had plotted his murder 3 times before, only to abandon each plan when the risk of witnesses became too great. For 2 years, Albert's murder remained a mystery. No leads, no suspects. Lorraine moved through life untouched, as if the blood on her hands had already dried. However, a relative arrested on an unrelated charge confessed to the crime, unraveling the web of deception Lorraine had so carefully manipulated. After nearly 1 decade of walking freely, justice was served on December 8, 2017. Lorraine was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, financial gain, and lying in wait. This time, the jury had no sympathy. As they recommended death, the judge agreed. Now 68 years old, Lorraine Hunter has spent the past 7 years on death row, counting down the days in the cold, silent corridors of prison. Soon, the woman who killed for money will have nothing left but time and the darkness that awaits her. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. The 1980s were a time of rebellion and change. What began as a troubled past led Cynthia into the arms of a man who shared her demons. Together, they became something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. In 1985, The cold of October had barely settled in California when Cynthia Kaufman and her boyfriend, James Marlowe, embarked on a violent, blood-soaked crime spree. They were predators cloaked in the guise of ordinary people. Their method was simple, yet horrifying. They lured young women in, offering false safety before subjecting them to unspeakable brutality. Among their victims was 20-year-old Karina Novas and 19-year-old Lyle Murray, two young women who had no idea they were stepping into the hands of monsters. The details of their deaths remain haunting. Kidnapped, robbed, assaulted, murdered. The couple executed their crimes with a chilling mix of premeditation and merciless cruelty, each act proving that neither Cynthia nor James had an ounce of remorse. But their reign of terror wouldn't last. On November 14, 1986, law enforcement finally caught up with them. The illusion shattered. The killers were in custody, but justice was far from over. In the courtroom, Cynthia played the victim. Her defense team argued she suffered from battered woman syndrome, claiming she was merely a pawn under James's control, a woman too frightened to resist. But the prosecution tore through the facade. Evidence placed her at the crime scenes. Witnesses described her as an active participant. The truth was undeniable. She wasn't just a bystander. She was a killer. In 1989, the verdict was handed down: death. Cynthia Kaufman became the first woman in California sentenced to death since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1977. Now, she waits in a cold gray cell on death row, the same fate she so easily dealt to her victims looming over her. Time moves forward, but justice does not forget. One day, the last chapter of her story will be written, and when it is, she will finally answer for the lives she took.